My name is Ethan Cole, and if there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Nothing cuts deeper than the wounds dealt by your own family. Outsiders can hurt you, sure, but when the people who raised you turn those knives, the scars never fade. They become part of your story. For as long as I can remember, I've been cast as the disappointment, the one who strayed, the child who refused to follow the script my parents wrote for us. My sister, Claire, was their masterpiece, successful, adored, the perfect reflection of everything they believed our family name should represent. And me? I was the dreamer, the wanderer, the one who supposedly wasted every chance they handed me. At least, that was the version of the story they told everyone else. The night it all came to a head was Claire's wedding. A night drenched in roses, candlelight, perfectly staged happiness, and underneath it, a stage where my father intended to perform one last show at my expense. The reception hall sparkled with chandeliers that spilled golden light across the room. Tables were dressed in navy cloth, silver utensils lined like soldiers, champagne bubbling in crystal flutes. Laughter moved through the air like music, conversations overlapping into a pleasant hum. To most people there, it probably felt like a dream, the kind of evening that made you think, this is what family looks like. But to me, every detail felt like theater, like a play I had no real part in. When my father, Richard, stood for his toast, the room stilled. He had always been a man who could command attention without effort, broad frame, booming voice, the kind of presence that turned conversations silent the moment he rose. He lifted his glass, his smile warm on the surface but sharp and just enough to cut. "You know," he began, "raising children is never simple. You try to guide them, teach them, prepare them for the world. And sometimes one child listens. One child embraces the lessons, carries on the family pride." He turned toward Claire, who glowed in her gown. She lowered her eyes shyly, though I caught the faintest flicker of discomfort in her smile. And then sometimes, Richard's gaze shifted and landed on me with the weight of an anvil. The other decides he knows better. He runs off, makes mistakes, chooses a different road. Polite laughter fluttered through the crowd, uncertain and uneasy. My chest tightened. I could feel eyes slide toward me, waiting for my reaction like spectators at a play. "And here we are, 10 years later," Richard continued, his voice rising as if he were delivering a sermon. "One child standing tall on her wedding day, surrounded by family, love, stability. And the other," he paused just long enough for the silence to sting, "still drifting, still living in an apartment." The word landed like a stone in my gut. Apartment. Such a simple word, but he had used it like a dagger. He chuckled, sipping his wine. "But that's life, isn't it? Some choices lead to stability, some don't." I clenched my jaw until it ached. Every part of me screamed to stand, to shout, but I stayed frozen, every muscle locked in place. My mother, Margaret, gave a delicate laugh, tilting her head as though to soften the edge of his cruelty. "Oh, Richard, don't be so harsh," she said, her voice dripping with mock chastisement. But her eyes gleamed with agreement. Then came the blow that hurt the most. Richard lifted his glass again and gestured toward me. "But of course, we love Ethan all the same. He's always been our dreamer. We kept him afloat longer than we should have, God knows. Paid his bills, gave him chance after chance. But that's what parents do, isn't it? You can't save someone from himself." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the tables. My heart plummeted. He had just paraded our family's private history like gossip for the crowd, twisting it into a show, making me the cautionary tale, the burden, the black sheep who wasted their generosity. Claire's new husband shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around hers. She looked torn, her lips parting as though she wanted to defend me, but the silence that followed was louder than words. And the betrayal wasn't just in my father's voice. It was in my mother's smile, pretending this cruelty was tradition. It was in Claire's silence, choosing her perfect day over standing beside me. It was in the way the guests lowered their eyes politely and drank, smoothing over the tension rather than intervening. They all sat there while Richard dismantled me, reducing years of sacrifice and labor into a caricature of failure. My fingers tightened around the keys in my pocket until the metal edges cut into my palm. Rage simmered, but beneath it, something colder settled. This wasn't just humiliation. This was the final break, the line I knew could never be uncrossed. I pressed my lips into a thin line and stayed perfectly still while Richard's toast ended with laughter that wasn't laughter at all, just people trying to brush away discomfort. He sat back down, smug and satisfied, as the chatter picked up again and silverware clinked across plates. But for me, the night was already split in two. Before his words, and after, I thought maybe the humiliation would end with the toast, that the evening would move on, and people would forget. But humiliation has a way of lingering. Like smoke after a fire, impossible to escape, even when you step outside for air. Later that evening, as music played and couples danced under the chandeliers, I stepped out onto the balcony to breathe. The night air was cool, a faint breeze carrying the scent of roses from the arrangements inside. I leaned on the railing, staring down at the city lights that flickered like stars across the skyline. That's when my mother, Margaret, joined me. Her gown shimmered under the moonlight, and in another life she might have looked graceful, regal. But tonight, every polished detail about her only sharpened the distance between us. "You shouldn't take it so personally," she said softly, adjusting the pearl necklace at her throat. I let out a short, bitter laugh. "He dragged me in front of 200 people, Mom. What part of that isn't personal?" Her eyes narrowed, not in anger but in pity, and somehow that stung worse. "Ethan, your father was only being honest. You've taken a different path than Claire. That's not a crime. But you have to admit your choices haven't exactly paid off." I turned to face her fully. "My choices? You mean working 2 jobs to keep my rent paid? You mean saving every penny so I could build something of my own, instead of just doing what he wanted?" Her lips pursed, as if the words tasted sour. "You always romanticize struggle, as if hardship is a badge of honor. But success is measured in results, Ethan. And results are something your sister understands." The old anger rose in me again. The one I had carried since childhood. The one that whispered I would never be enough for them, no matter what I did. "You think I wanted this?" I snapped, louder than I intended. "You think I asked to be the one you're ashamed of? All I ever wanted was your support. Not your money, not your handouts. Just belief." But that was always reserved for Claire. Her expression softened for a brief second, but it was gone just as quickly. She sighed, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to feel comforting but only felt heavy. "One day, you'll understand why we pushed you, why we couldn't let you drift forever." And with that, she turned back inside, her heels clicking softly against the tile. I stayed outside long after she left, staring at the city lights until my eyes blurred. I thought of every late night I'd spent sketching designs for projects no one believed in, of the countless rejections, the odd jobs, the sacrifices I'd made not because I was irresponsible, but because I was trying to carve out a life that felt like mine. And yet, to them, it all boiled down to one word: failure. By the time I re-entered the hall, the night was winding down. Guests were drunk and laughing, shoes were abandoned under tables, and the band played its last few songs. I found Claire near the dessert table, her gown slightly wrinkled, her makeup softened with the hours. She looked up when she saw me, her smile faltering. "Ethan," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "I'm sorry about Dad. Are you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes dropped. I wanted to say something. I did, but it was my wedding day. And you didn't want to ruin it," I finished for her. She winced, guilt flickering across her face. "It's not that I don't care. I couldn't fight him tonight." I studied her for a long moment. My sister, the golden child, who had always known how to play the role they demanded of her. Part of me wanted to forgive her. Another part wanted to scream. Instead, I just said, "Congratulations, Claire. I hope you're happy." And I left before she could respond. The weeks after the wedding were a blur of silence. My phone buzzed with occasional messages from relatives, all polite but hollow. Some congratulated me for handling it well, others offered half-hearted advice, telling me not to take Richard's words to heart. But none of them really understood. None of them had lived under the weight of being the family's disappointment. I buried myself in work, both my day job at the repair shop and my late nights freelancing design projects. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And more than anything, it was mine. Still, the wound festered. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard my father's voice echoing through the banquet hall. Still living in an apartment, still drifting, still wasting what we gave him. Until one evening, I decided I couldn't live with that echo anymore. I sat at my desk, stacks of sketches and prototypes spread out before me, and I thought, what if I prove them wrong? What if I take every ounce of doubt they've thrown at me and build something out of it? That night, I made a promise to myself. Not to Richard, not to Margaret, not even to Claire. To myself, I would succeed not out of spite, but because I knew I could. Because my story didn't end as a family failure. It was just beginning. The first step toward my promise wasn't glamorous. It didn't involve sudden success or miraculous opportunities. It started with exhaustion, late nights spent over a flickering laptop, weekends sacrificed, mornings where my eyes burned from lack of sleep, but my determination kept me upright. My apartment, tiny, cluttered, with a leaky faucet that groaned whenever I turned it, became my workshop. The dining table turned into a drafting station. Coffee mugs stacked in corners like trophies of survival. The hum of my old fan was the soundtrack of my ambition. I worked at the repair shop by day, fixing everything from cracked phones to busted generators. By night, I poured myself into design. Blueprints, sketches, 3D models on software so outdated it sometimes froze for hours. But each piece, each line drawn, was a step towards something bigger. Of course, the world wasn't waiting for me with open arms. Rejections filled my inbox. Emails that began with "unfortunately," or "we've decided to move forward with another candidate." I could wallpaper my apartment with those messages if I wanted to. But every rejection was fuel. Every no meant I was closer to the yes that mattered. Then came the day everything shifted. It started with a message from a small manufacturing startup based 2 towns over. They had seen one of my designs on a freelance forum, a compact, energy-efficient water filter I had drafted months before, and wanted to know if I'd be interested in consulting with them. I stared at the email for a long time, convinced it was some kind of scam. But after research and a cautious phone call, I realized it was real. When I showed up at their office, a converted warehouse buzzing with young engineers and half-finished prototypes, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. The founder, a weary man named Alex, shook my hand with a grin. "We don't care where you come from," he said. "We care about what you can build." Those words lodged themselves in my chest. No judgment about my past, no comparisons to Claire, no lectures about drifting. Just belief in what I could do. For weeks, I threw myself into the project. I stayed in the warehouse until midnight, testing filters, refining blueprints, running simulations. My hands were raw from soldering, my clothes smelled of metal and sweat, but I didn't care. I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. And slowly, things began to change. The startup gained attention after we presented the prototype at a local tech fair. Investors circled, reporters snapped photos. People asked questions not about who I was, but about what I had created. For once, my work spoke louder than the shadow my family had cast over me. But the real test came weeks later, at a family gathering. It was Margaret's birthday, and I debated not going. Part of me wanted to avoid the entire circus: Richard's booming voice, the sideways glances, the inevitable comments about finding stability. But another part of me, the part that had made that promise to myself, knew I had to face them. When I walked into the house, everything felt the same. The polished floors, the framed photos of Claire's achievements, the smell of Margaret's favorite vanilla candles. My parents greeted me politely, as though I were a distant cousin instead of their son. Dinner was tense but civil until Richard decided to perform again. "So, Ethan," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "still tinkering away in that apartment of yours?" His words were smooth, casual on the surface, but I heard the bite underneath. This time, though, I didn't shrink. I leaned back in my chair and met his gaze. "Actually, Dad, I've been working with a startup. We just finished a prototype that's drawing investor interest. It might even hit the market next year, The table quieted. For the first time in years, Richard didn't have a retort ready. His brow furrowed just slightly, like he hadn't expected me to answer with something solid. Claire's eyes widened with surprise. And was that pride? She smiled faintly at me across the table. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. Well, that's certainly progress. Progress. The word was lukewarm, but I held onto it anyway. Because for once, I wasn't the disappointment fumbling through excuses. I was a man with proof, with momentum, with something they couldn't belittle without sounding absurd. Inside, I felt a spark ignite. Small, fragile, but real. That night, as I left their house, I realized something important. I no longer needed their approval. Their validation wasn't the fuel that drove me anymore. I was building my own story, one they couldn't rewrite. Momentum is a strange thing. Once it starts rolling, it carries you faster than you expect. Like a wheel on a slope you can't stop even if you wanted to. That's how the next year of my life unfolded. The startup grew. Investors came on board. Orders trickled in, then poured. Suddenly, I wasn't just Ethan Cole, the drifter my family mocked. I was Ethan Cole, lead designer at a company that was making real change in communities that needed it most. The water filters we created weren't just technical achievements. They were lifelines for villages and towns where clean water was a luxury. I still lived in my tiny apartment, the one Richard loved to use as his favorite punchline. But to me, it was no longer a cage. It was a launch pad. Every creak in the walls, every drip from the leaky faucet, reminded me where I had started and why I couldn't afford to give up. My days were brutal. Early mornings at the shop, then long hours at the warehouse with the team. I ate more instant noodles than I'd care to admit. Sleep was a luxury, social life non-existent, but none of it mattered. For the first time in years, I woke each day with purpose burning in my chest. Word of the project spread beyond our region. A nonprofit partnered with us to distribute units overseas. Photos came back of families gathered around clean water for the first time in months. Kids laughing, mothers crying, fathers clasping our hands in gratitude. I stared at those pictures until my eyes blurred, because for the first time, I felt what real impact looked like. Still, my parents remained a shadow in the background. Richard never called, never asked, never acknowledged. Margaret sent polite messages now and then, asking if I was eating well, if I needed anything, as though I were still a child incapable of standing on my own. Claire reached out more often, but even then, her words carried hesitation, like she was caught between pride in me and loyalty to them. I thought maybe I didn't care anymore. That there, silence was finally powerless. But then came the charity gala. Our startup was invited to present at a fundraiser hosted by some of the biggest names in the city. It was the kind of event Richard and Margaret adored, formal, glittering, filled with influential people. I nearly declined, not wanting to be paraded again like at Claire's wedding. But Alex insisted. We need visibility, he said. This could change everything for us. So I went. The ballroom was a sea of gowns and tuxedos, chandeliers dripping crystals, champagne flowing like water. As I stood by our booth, explaining the filter system to donors and city officials, I felt a strange mix of pride and nerves. This was my work, my creation, on display for the world. And then I saw them, Richard and Margaret, walking arm in arm through the crowd like royalty. Heads turned as they passed, people greeting them warmly. For a moment, I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Part of me wanted to duck behind the display and vanish, but instead, Richard spotted me. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. He approached with the slow confidence of a man used to being the center of attention. Well, he said, his voice carrying that same booming authority. Ethan, didn't expect to see you here. I straightened my shoulders. I was invited. Our company's presenting. Tonight. His gaze flicked to the display, then back to me. A smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Interesting. Seems you've found something to keep you busy. Margaret laid a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes darting nervously between us. Richard, she murmured. Not here. But Richard never missed a stage. You know, he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, I always told Ethan he had potential. He just took the scenic route getting there. Cost us a lot along the way, didn't it? The words landed like stones, sharp and heavy. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. Others glanced between us, curious, hungry for drama. I could feel the old heat rising in me, the same humiliation that had burned at Claire's wedding. But this time, I refused to let it consume me. I took a steady breath, looked him directly in the eye, and said, "No, Dad, it didn't cost you. It built me. Every struggle, every rejection, every night you dismissed as wasted, it led me here. To work that matters. To something bigger than your approval." The air between us thickened. Richard's smile faltered for the first time I could remember. Alex stepped in then, shaking Richard's hand warmly. "Your son is brilliant," he said. "None of this would exist without him." Guests nearby nodded, murmuring agreement. And in that moment, I saw something flicker across Richard's face: pride, maybe, or fear of losing control of the story he'd written about me. He said nothing. For once, the man of endless words had none, and that silence was worth more than any applause. That night at the gala marked a turning point not just in my career, but in my identity. For so long, I had been defined by my family's judgment, trapped in the role they cast me in. The drifter, the disappointment, the burden. But standing there, in front of Richard, in front of all those polished strangers, I realized something important. I didn't need to prove myself to him anymore, or to Margaret, or even to Claire. I only needed to keep building, keep moving forward, keep creating a life that reflected me. Still, letting go of that need for validation was easier said than done. Some nights, lying awake in my apartment, I would hear Richard's voice echoing. We kept him afloat longer than we should have. The words clung to me like shadows, reminding me of every moment I had been made small. But every morning, when I walked into the warehouse and saw the prototypes lined up, when I worked alongside a team that respected me not for who my family was but for what I could do, I felt lighter, stronger, like I was slowly stitching myself back together. Months passed. Our startup secured a major contract with a humanitarian organization overseas. The deal meant expansion, funding, recognition. Suddenly, I was traveling, something I had only dreamed of during those long nights in my cramped apartment. I found myself in villages, where children gathered around me with wide eyes, their hands reaching out for clean water. In communities where elders clasped my shoulders and thanked me in words I couldn't understand, but didn't need to. Gratitude doesn't require translation. Each trip, each handshake, each smile became a thread in the new tapestry of my life. A tapestry I was weaving myself, free from Richard's script. Claire called me one evening while I was abroad. Her voice was softer than usual, stripped of its usual careful balance between family loyalty and sisterly love. "I've been watching what you're doing," she said. "And Ethan, I'm proud of you." I didn't realize how much I had needed those words until they cracked something open in me. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Thanks, Claire. That means more than you know." She hesitated. "Dad won't say it, not out loud, but I think he knows. He sees it. He just doesn't know how to let go of the story he's always told about you." Her words hit me like a strange mix of balm and blade. Part of me was relieved to hear it. Another part was angry that Richard's pride was locked behind his own ego, that he couldn't bring himself to admit he'd been wrong. But then I realized I didn't need his admission. His silence at the gala had already said enough. Years slipped by in a blur of work and growth. The startup became a recognized name in sustainable technology. My apartment, once the symbol of Richard's mockery, was replaced with an office overlooking the city skyline. Yet I never forgot where I came from. I kept the old sketches pinned on my office wall, coffee stains and all, to remind me of the nights when it was just me, my dreams, and a flickering laptop. And then came the day I never thought would happen. Richard called me. His voice on the phone was older, softer. The booming authority had dimmed, replaced by something almost uncertain. "Ethan," he said, pausing as though the name itself was difficult to speak. I'd like to see what you've been working on." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, wondering if I had imagined it. But it was real. Weeks later, He and Margaret walked into the warehouse, not dressed in their usual polished armor of suits and pearls, but in simple clothes, as if they had shed some of their armor just to be there. My team greeted them warmly, showing them around. I watched as Richard studied the machines, the prototypes, the photographs of communities we had helped. And for the first time in my life, I saw his eyes soften with something I had never expected to witness: respect. He didn't apologize, not with words, but when he shook my hand at the end of the tour, his grip was firm, steady. His eyes held mine longer than usual, as though he were finally seeing me not as the drifter, not as the failure, but as the man I had become. That was enough. In the days after the anniversary celebration, I found myself replaying the night in my mind, not with the ache of regret, but with the clarity of distance. It was strange how different it all felt standing in that same kind of ballroom under the same kind of chandeliers, surrounded by the same whispers and glances. Years ago, those whispers had shredded me. Now, they barely grazed the surface. I realized something profound that night. True transformation is not about erasing the past, but about learning to stand within it without being consumed. The following months only deepened that lesson. Our company launched a groundbreaking initiative in South America, bringing sustainable power to villages that had lived without electricity for generations. The newspapers called it revolutionary. Awards were given, speeches made, but the part that mattered most to me was the look on the children's faces when the lights flickered on for the first time. Their laughter echoed louder than any applause I could ever receive. Claire called me afterward, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Ethan," she said, "I told you, didn't I? You were meant to do this. Not for them, not for Dad, for the world." She was right. And yet, family has a way of pulling you back, no matter how far you've run. Richard's health began to decline shortly after the anniversary. At first, it was little things: fatigue, doctor's visits, whispered concerns from Margaret. But soon it became unavoidable. The man who had once towered over every room now struggled to climb the stairs of his own house. I visited often, though I told myself it was for Margaret's sake as much as his. Sitting by his bedside, I found the old resentment stirring again, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, I felt something different: pity, perhaps even compassion. For all his power and pride, Richard was just a man, flawed, vulnerable mortal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft orange glow, he turned to me with a look I had never seen before. Not authority, not dismissal, just fragility. "I was hard on you," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Too hard. I thought I was shaping you. I didn't see I was breaking you." For a moment, I couldn't speak. All the words I had rehearsed over the years, the accusations, the explanations, the anger melted away. Instead, I simply nodded. "You didn't break me," I said softly. "You forced me to build myself." He closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and in that silence, I felt decades of weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was peace. When Richard passed a few months later, the funeral was grand, just as he would have wanted, full of flowers, dignitaries, and speeches about legacy. Margaret stood tall, her grief hidden behind the same composure she had worn all her life. Harper wept openly, her children clinging to her. Claire held my hand, her strength steady as ever. And me? I didn't cry, not because I didn't feel, but because I had already said goodbye in that quiet room, in that final moment of truth between us. After the funeral, I walked alone through the city streets, the world buzzing with life around me. I thought about the journey, the nights of ridicule, the moments of triumph, the sting of exclusion, the warmth of eventual recognition, and I understood something I hadn't before. The story of my life wasn't about Richard. It wasn't about proving him wrong or earning his praise. It was about resilience, about turning every rejection into fuel, every wound into wisdom. I had once been the son no one believed in, the dreamer mocked and ignored. Now, I was the man who had lit up villages, who had given children hope, who had built a legacy not of wealth or titles, but of impact. And as I stood there, the city lights flickering like stars at my feet, I smiled. Because in the end, the truest victory wasn't in being acknowledged. It was in never needing to be. Months after Richard's passing, life began to settle into a strange rhythm. The family estate, once dominated by his presence, felt quieter, almost hollow. Margaret spent her days surrounded by friends from her social circles, hosting luncheons that masked her grief beneath polished conversation. Harper, busy with her children, threw herself into family life, while Claire continued to balance her own household with her unwavering support for me. I found myself returning often to the warehouse, not just to oversee operations, but because it was the place where my real family, the one I had chosen, existed. The hum of machinery, the chatter of engineers, the spark of ideas, those were my comforts now. But even in that space, Richard's shadow lingered, not as a burden anymore, but as a reminder. Every blueprint, every initiative carried echoes of the men who had doubted me, and how his doubt had forged me. It was during this period that a journalist requested an in-depth feature on the company. Normally, I avoided personal stories, preferring to let the work speak for itself. But something in me shifted. Perhaps it was the finality of Richard's death, or the realization that the next chapter wasn't just about building, it was about recording. When the article was published, the headline read, "From Outcast to Visionary, the Unlikely Journey of Ethan Hale." Reading it, I felt a mix of discomfort and pride. Discomfort, because the wounds of the past still stung when laid bare for the world. Pride, because the truth was no longer hidden. The world knew not only what I had achieved, but what I had endured to achieve it. The article spread quickly, shared across networks, discussed in boardrooms and classrooms alike. Letters poured in, young dreamers who saw themselves in my struggle, parents who admitted they recognized pieces of Richard in themselves, asking how to change before it was too late. For the first time, my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to others too. Claire was the first to call after the piece went viral. "You realize," she teased, "you've become a symbol now." No pressure. I laughed, but deep down, I knew she was right. The story of Ethan Hale was no longer confined to family gatherings or quiet resentments. It was out there, shaping lives I might never see. That realization brought a new responsibility. I began accepting invitations I once declined: lectures at universities, panels at global summits, mentorship programs for young innovators. Not because I wanted the spotlight, but because I understood its power. The more I spoke, the more I saw the same spark I once carried reflected in others. And yet, every time I stood on a stage, I carried a silent promise. I would never become Richard. I would never crush a dream under the weight of my own expectations. Instead, I would nurture them, give them space to breathe, even if they faltered. Margaret eventually reached out, though her words were cautious, measured. She invited me to dinner at the estate, just the two of us. The evening was quiet, the grand dining hall feeling cavernous with only 2 plates set on the long table. She poured wine, her hands steady but her eyes betraying something softer. "Your father was proud of you," she said at last, her voice low. He didn't know how to say it. Neither did I. I studied her face, the lines of age, the walls of pride still standing, but with cracks now visible. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. We ate mostly in silence after that, but it was a silence that felt less like distance and more like understanding. Leaving the estate that night, I realized the cycle was ending. The anger, the yearning, the endless need for validation, it was fading. What remained was purpose. And purpose, I knew, was stronger than pain. The years that followed brought a different kind of challenge. Success had already been secured, recognition achieved. But the question that lingered in the quiet hours was one I had never asked before. What comes after? For so long, my life had been fueled by resistance, pushing against Richard's disapproval, clawing my way through ridicule, building in the shadows of doubt. But now, with the battles won, I faced a horizon unshaped by conflict. And it was both liberating and unsettling. I decided that if the past was about survival, the future had to be about legacy. Not the kind my father had pursued, measured in reputation, prestige, and power, but one woven from impact, endurance, and kindness. So, the Ethan Hale Foundation was born. At first, it was small, an offshoot of the company, funded by profits I could afford to spare. But quickly, it grew into something far larger. We created scholarships for underprivileged students, grants for young inventors with ideas but no resources, and partnerships with rural communities across continents. Our mission was simple: to find the dreamers who were overlooked, the voices that were dismissed, and give them the chance I had once been denied. I traveled extensively, visiting villages, universities, and workshops. I sat with children who reminded me of myself, eyes bright with impossible ideas, weighed down by circumstances beyond their control. I told them my story, not as a polished tale of triumph, but as a raw journey through doubt, exclusion, and persistence. And every time, I saw the same spark ignite. Claire often joined me on these trips, documenting everything with her ever-present journal. "You realize," she'd say, tapping her pen against the pages, "this is the real work. Everything before was just practice." She wasn't wrong. One of the most memorable moments came during a trip to Southeast Asia, where we introduced a clean water system to a remote mountain community. An old man clasped my hands, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks. Through a translator, he whispered, "You've given my grandchildren a future." It was then I understood. Success is fleeting, but impact endures. Back home, the media continued to follow my journey, though I cared less about the headlines. What mattered were the lives changed, the doors opened, the stories rewritten. Margaret grew older, her once unshakable poise softening with time. She visited the foundation headquarters occasionally, walking through the halls filled with photographs of the people we had helped. One afternoon, she paused before a picture of children in Africa, smiling with their new solar lamps. "They look so happy," she murmured. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time in decades, I saw not just pride but genuine admiration. "They remind me of you," she added quietly. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Harper, too, began to bridge the distance. She invited me more often to family gatherings, her children treating me as though I had always been present. We laughed over old stories, though some memories were too painful to revisit. Slowly, the fractures in our family began to mend. Not perfectly, but enough to hold together. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded, I often thought back to that night at Harper's wedding, the moment that had nearly broken me. And I realized something extraordinary. Had I been embraced then, had I been celebrated instead of humiliated, I might never have fought so fiercely. I might never have built, endured, or found the strength to turn pain into power. The very rejection that once scarred me had become the crucible that shaped me. And now, standing on the other side, I could see the strange beauty in it. As the years slipped further by, the foundation flourished beyond what I had ever imagined. What began as a vision born out of pain and perseverance had become a global force, with branches on nearly every continent. The Ethan Hale Foundation was no longer just my project, it was a movement. But with growth came the inevitable question: who would carry it forward when I no longer could? I was not the same man who once stayed up all night sketching prototypes in a cramped apartment, driven by anger and rejection. Age had settled into my bones, and though my mind was still sharp, I knew the day would come when the torch would have to be passed. It was during a trip to South America that the answer revealed itself. We had just finished installing a solar-powered irrigation system in a drought-stricken region, and as I watched the children run through the fields, laughing as water flowed again, one of my young engineers approached me. Her name was Sophia, barely 25, full of restless energy and ideas that reminded me so much of myself at her age. She spoke with conviction, challenging old methods, refusing to accept impossible as an answer. I saw in her the same fire I had once carried, untamed and undeniable. Over time, I began mentoring her more closely, giving her not just technical responsibilities but the chance to lead, to make decisions, to bear the weight of vision. Others emerged, two bright minds from different corners of the world, each carrying their own scars, their own stories of being underestimated. Together, They became the heartbeat of the foundation's future. Back in the city, my warehouse, the place where everything began, was transformed into a living museum. The machines, the blueprints, the photographs of every milestone lined the walls. Visitors walked through, not to admire wealth or luxury, but to witness the journey of an outcast who had turned rejection into revolution. Claire insisted on curating part of it herself. Her journals, filled with decades of observations, were displayed in glass cases, pages open to the world. On one of them, in her looping handwriting, was a sentence that stopped me in my tracks. The greatest victory is not in proving them wrong, but in becoming who you were meant to be despite them. Reading it, I realized she had captured my entire life in a single line. Margaret grew frailer with time, yet her visits became more frequent. Sometimes we would sit together in silence, watching the younger generation at work. Once, she reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so delicate. "You've built something far greater than your father ever dreamed of," she whispered, "and you did it without becoming him." Tears welled in her eyes, and I understood then that this was her way of asking for forgiveness, not just for herself, but for both of them. I squeezed her hand gently and nodded. There was no need for more words. Harper's children grew up, and I found myself in a role I had never expected, that of a mentor, not just to strangers, but to family. They sought my advice on careers, on love, on life, and every time they thanked me, every time they looked at me with admiration, I felt the sharp contrast to the way I had once looked to Richard. It was proof that cycles could be broken. As I entered my twilight years, I often sat by the window of my home, overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered, alive with the hum of progress, much of it powered by technologies my team had pioneered. The laughter of children in the distance carried on the wind, reminders of futures once impossible. And I thought back to the boy I had been, the one sitting alone at a wedding, humiliated, dismissed, invisible. I wanted to reach through time, to place a hand on his shoulder, to whisper, "Hold on. One day they will see." But more importantly, one day, you won't need them to. Because the truth was simple. I had already won the only battle that mattered. Not against Richard, not against the whispers of a ballroom, but against a part of me that once believed I wasn't enough. The rest, the accolades, the recognition, the legacy, was just proof of what resilience could build. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in gold, I smiled, knowing that the story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every dreamer who had ever been told they couldn't. And it would outlive me. In the autumn of my life, the pace of my days slowed, though the world around me seemed to accelerate with unrelenting energy. The foundation thrived under new leadership, guided by Sophia and a council of brilliant young visionaries. Their projects reached places I had only dreamed of: remote deserts, war-torn regions, forgotten towns where hope had once been a rumor. And I watched with quiet pride, knowing that my role was no longer to lead, but to witness. My health began to falter, as age demands its due. There were days when my legs refused to carry me far, when my hands trembled as I reached for a pen. Yet even in fragility, I found strength in the knowledge that I was no longer needed at the helm. The seeds I had planted had taken root, and the forest was thriving without me. One winter evening, Claire visited me at my home. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes still bright but softened by time. She carried her journal, though her handwriting had grown shaky with the years. "You should write the last chapter yourself," she said, sliding the book toward me. I hesitated. For so long, my story had been told by others, by journalists, by historians, even by Claire's faithful pen. To write it myself felt both daunting and unnecessary. But that night, as snow fell quietly outside, I picked up my pen and began. I didn't write about the accomplishments, the wealth, or the recognition. Instead, I wrote about the moments that mattered most: the laughter of children when the lights first came on, the trembling hands of a grandfather who no longer feared for his family's future, the relief in Margaret's eyes when she finally let go of pride. And I wrote about the boy I had once been, sitting in silence while the world doubted him. How that boy had grown into a man, not by spite, but by perseverance. Claire read the pages later, tears slipping down her cheeks. This, she whispered, is the truest version of you. Not long after, Harper's children, now grown with families of their own, organized a gathering in my honor. They called it not a farewell, but a celebration of life. Friends, colleagues, and strangers whose lives had been touched by the foundation filled the hall. Photographs and artifacts lined the walls, the first blueprint, the early prototypes, the letters from children whose futures had been rewritten. Sophia spoke that evening, her voice steady, her presence commanding. You gave us more than inventions, she said. You gave us permission to dream in a world that told us not to. And because of that, your story will never end. As I listened, surrounded by faces from every chapter of my journey, I realized I had achieved something far greater than I ever set out to do. I hadn't just built machines or systems. I had built people, leaders, dreamers, believers, and they would carry forward what I could not. In my final years, I spent most days in quiet reflection, often sitting in the garden behind my house. The air was filled with bird song, the flowers tended by hands younger than mine. Occasionally, children from the neighborhood would run past, waving, calling me Mr. Ethan as though I were some local legend. And perhaps in their eyes, I was. When the end finally came, it was gentle. I drifted to sleep one evening, the journal Claire had given me resting on my bedside table, its final page filled with words of peace. The world moved on as it always does, but my story lived in the work, in the people, in the light that now reached corners of the earth once left in darkness. And years later, when a new generation stood on stages I had once stood upon, they spoke not of Ethan Hale, the outcast turned visionary, but of what his journey had made possible. Because the truest legacy is not a name carved in stone. It is the fire lit in others, burning long after you're gone.